Hey guys, Richard here with Richard C. Howard and Associates. This is the Government Sales Momentum Podcast. In this podcast, we are going to talk about strategies and techniques small businesses can use to sell their products and services to the U.S. federal government. All right, let's get started. Hey, this is Richard here with Richard C. Howard and Associates, and this is the Government Sales Momentum Podcast with Louis-Orndorff, Part 2. You may have heard our first podcast where we really got into some of the specifics of a government contract, what you need to watch out for and be careful with when you're on contract with the government. We decided to get into Part 2 of this podcast to talk about, before getting into the contract, some of the things that you want to look at in a RFP or a solicitation from the government, which you are then going to put a proposal together on. And we've split it into a couple different areas we wanted to talk about. Without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to you, Lou, because we were going to talk about the evaluating an opportunity piece, and then where you make the go, no-go decision. And then once you make the go decision, there's Part 2, which is then really getting into some of the parameters there. What can you tell us about evaluating a solicitation or an opportunity and making that go, no-go decision?
Well, there's a long road up to the point where you are looking at a proposal or an RFP, whatever that looks like, an request for a quote or request for a bid or request for proposal. Let's talk about something and kind of put it in the framework of a proposal. So something you have to formally respond to that has multiple sections, and it's kind of a pretty big target. So one of the things I think is really important, and every company knows this, when you're evaluating whether or not to submit a proposal, you have to think about some very important things for your company. The number one thing that I always advise clients about is how does it fit into your business strategy, your business plan? Because just because you can do an effort doesn't mean that it's really in line with your long-term strategy and goals. And if you haven't really thought that through, you might want to think that through, because you can get a really good contract and it may derail your entire business organization, operations. It may completely put you off balance, either financially or resources, or you have your limited, very very smart people who now are being asked to do three different major efforts. So you really need to be careful when you think about, do we want to do this proposal? So I think every company who's taken a look at that has got this basics, but sometimes your appetite gets big, your eyes get big, and you say, "Hey, we could do that. Let's go do that."
Right.
But the things you want to think about is your bid, no bid. First of all, there's a cost to putting the proposal together. The cost is in time and in some cases money. To put together a proposal means that you have to go through and really understand what's required, which takes some time. And then you have to actually generate a response to that, which again takes some time. So if you've got your key players in your organization and you say, "Hey, we want you to carve out everything you're doing, we want you to continue doing, and then on the side, we want you to put 4 or 5 hours a day together for a period of time to generate this proposal that we're trying to go after," you really need to think as a team, is it worth that effort? Ultimately, is it in line with your business strategy? Does it meet your future objectives? And make that bid, no bid decision, not from a can we make the money, but how does this help our company do what we want to do? And can we absorb the cost, or do we want to pay somebody to do that? It's a time and money conversation. So I think that bid, no bid is kind of the first block, if you will.
Right. And if I could just interject here for a second, just talking about kind of aligning with the mission, right? Because especially companies, if maybe it's their first contract, they're trying to get their foot in the door, and they may be tempted to kind of go off of what the company mission is. I think we've all done work that we haven't necessarily been passionate about in the past, right? So, I could see a company lands a contract on something doesn't kind of fall in line with what their mission and values are. They're trying to execute that. And you mentioned this in the other podcast. Now they have an eye out there for other contracts that maybe do line up with their mission, right? It could be easy not to do work to the level that you normally would if the contract is for something you're not really that interested in, or maybe it is not your. And you mentioned reputation.
I got to tell you a story. I'm sorry,
No, this is perfect.
One time we wrote a contract. We needed to move a C-130 from one base to another base, and it was a static display. So that means it couldn't fly anymore. Basically, it had to be disassembled and moved.
It's basically a
And we
model
had,
on the base, right?
pardon?
It's basically a huge model airplane, basically.
Yeah, and now it goes from being an operational aircraft to being up on a pedestal out in front of a base somewhere or something like that. It's a big aircraft. So the company that we ultimately selected, and they fit the criteria. They convinced us that they could do it. Was a house moving company. This company was outstanding at moving houses. They had a good track record of moving houses. They moved big things. They knew how to move things down the freeway, and they convinced us that they knew what to do and they had the right experts to come in and do the job. Well, the first thing that happened is they went out there and they looked at it and said, wait a minute, we don't know how to remove the wings from a C-130, because when we started removing them, all this fuel and oil and lubricant spilled all over the place. And now the base is mad at us and we got to clean it up. We got a hazardous spill. So we're done. So they realized that while they thought, hey, it's moving large objects, they went after this contract and they won it, and then immediately just figured out we absolutely have no idea what to do here.
Right, and that
so there's a good example,
right? And that could affect their reputation, right?
Oh yeah.
Exactly. And you mentioned that in the last podcast, just how, doing good work on the contract, because it is, your reputation will get out there. Everyone kind of talks to each other. And inevitably, if you do walk away from a contract, that can have pretty negative consequences on you doing business with the government in the future.
Yeah. And it did in that case. We spent a lot of time, making their life miserable. So.
Yeah, there's that. What are those hidden details, like how to remove a wing from the C-130, can definitely come to bite you. So,
yeah, I know that's off target, but anyway, good story.
That's great. And so that's evaluating a proposal, right? Kind of going through the bid, no bid process and how important that is. But let's say you've decided to go forward and put the actual proposal together. I know you've called it a science project in the past. What would your advice be to a company that has made that decision, is putting that proposal together? What are some of the things that you would look at as a former contracting officer?
Well, I've evaluated hundreds, if not thousands, of proposals. I've been part of the decision process at every level. And I'll tell you, the number one thing that I just cannot emphasize enough is read the question, answer the question. Don't get cute, don't get fancy, don't get elaborate. But if you have a requirement and the government says, show us how you're going to do this, tell us how you're going to do this, then answer the question. So without fail, I have contractors who come in and say, effectively, well, government, it's clear you don't know what you're talking about. Let me tell you what the right answer is. And let me tell you the question you should ask, and we'll answer the question you should have asked. Fail. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if they're absolutely right, 100%. If you don't read the question and answer the question, then the evaluation that will get you the win will give you a 0 or a lower score on that. Even if you don't think it's right, it's read the question, answer the question.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. And, what I find interesting, and we could talk about this a little bit, is, so this is when the solicitation is out, right? And those questions, it's really important to answer those questions directly and not to add or kind of suggest new things. What I would say is that probably the place to suggest requirements or suggest questions they need to ask is during the RFI process or the sources sought process, where the solicitation isn't out yet and now there are questions that are being asked. What do you think about that? Or what are your thoughts on kind of the RFI and their ability to legitimately influence an opportunity?
Yeah, I will tell you, when we put an RFI out or sources sought, we are truly hungry for somebody to come back and say, look, here is the most efficient way for you to solve this problem. Here's the best contract type. Here's the best contract structure. Here are some technical parameters that you need to consider. The government most of the time just really doesn't know. It's not just a requirement. It's honestly, those few times that I had contractors really come back and say, hey, this is best as a fixed price contract, or this is best as this type of contract, or these parameters. They almost always influence the contract because we really honestly wanted that input. Now, every once in a while, you can tell when a contractor is trying to influence something specifically to their advantage, and we'll look at that. We would look at that, but for the most part, take advantage of that. That's a legitimate spot to influence the whole solicitation. After that's done, you need to be really careful how you try to influence what's going on, because it's your proposal. What's in your proposal is pretty much it.
Right.
And I'll just pull that thread one more. Answer the question is the key.
Okay.
Don't try to interpret what are they thinking. What do they want to see? What is it that they're gonna like more than something else? Your business. The whole point. If a person is evaluating your answer, and it's clear that you know what you're doing, you're answering the question, you're going to get max points for that. Right. Now, if you have a better solution, it's all based on you answered the question. Don't try to influence the mind of the person who's evaluating. At the end of the day, most of those don't really go that well.
Yeah, that's great advice. And once you're at that RFP point, like you said, just answering the questions as they're presented, there are some things not to do that we talked about, like buying baseball. I think the example you gave me off camera was, the company should not be trying to buy baseball uniforms for the baseball team in an effort to influence. Anytime you try to spend money to influence, you're probably walking down a road that's illegal.
And be careful, because you keep the government people in trouble just and derail an entire acquisition, and it can be pretty dire.
Sure. No, that's great. That's great advice. This is just a short podcast, but I think one that's needed to talk a little bit about proposals and what they should be looking at. Any parting words before we end it for today?
Yeah, I do. I think it's important, if you're going to put together a proposal, that you find your team of people who are going to answer the questions. And before you start answering the questions, read from beginning to end what is required, and sit down together and have kind of a roadmap or an overall strategy of how you collectively want to answer it. Have a vision of what your collective answer is going to be, so you don't have a whole bunch of individual solutions that may not necessarily fit together. It's hard to do at the end. I've seen it, and you can tell when you're reading a proposal that they jammed it together with Band-Aids at the end and tried to make pieces fit together that weren't quite lined up. You can also tell when somebody thought through it and just said, okay, holistically in the round, let's approach it this way. You guys take this quarter, you guys take this quarter, we'll take this quarter, and then let's make sure the seams meet up as we put this together. So go through it a couple of times to just make sure that you haven't missed anything. Once you write your framework, it's useful to go through and read it again. And it's a step I think a lot of people miss.
Sure.
And that's where you really catch the part where, hey, let's make sure we answer all these questions. And you can tell when somebody didn't read the proposal after they got started as well. There's just holes in it.
Sure.
So kind of working as a team and coming together, it comes through in the product. And that is exactly what the government wants, is a cohesive team that actually has a high probability of working well together, not only with themselves, but with the government. Okay.
No, that's great. Thanks again for coming on. If anyone listening wants to talk to Lou or I about, have some contract questions, proposal questions, we'd love to answer them. richardchoward.com. Thanks again for tuning in. And we look forward to the next episode with Louis.